Let's see what Professor Asad Abu Khalil, a former guest of ours and a most impressive professor at California State University. He's an author and a political commentator, and he's with us now. Before turning to the Middle East professor, let's deal with the American election first. On the face of it, it seems like it's Zion Don against Genocide Joe and his surrogate, cackling Kamala Harris. Both of them entirely in thrall to the Israel lobby. But most of the Jewish people in the United States will not be voting for Donald Trump. The Zionist evangelical Christians will be voting for Donald Trump. So it's a bit more complicated than at first it appears, isn't it? The only reason I prefer Trump to Harris is I already know what Harris is doing right now to the Middle East. I don't need to look in the crystal ball to see what Donald Trump might do. What's your stance on that?
Well, I mean, firstly, I've been here since 1983 and I never voted because I knew I was going to be disappointed and that the people I'll vote for, Republican or Democrat, are going to do something really bad in terms of social justice here in the United States or in the Middle East in particular. In the case you're mentioning, you're absolutely right. We should hold responsible for the genocide going on and the war of aggression against 7 countries. I mean, Israel is now launching wars against 7 countries. We have to hold responsible the Biden, Harris, and the Blinken administration. They are solely responsible. That does not mean that Donald Trump is going to bring about a radical change in American foreign policy in the Middle East. His record in the Middle East was absolutely bad, but he did not initiate or sponsor a variety of wars as we have seen with this administration. And you're right in your earlier remark. I mean, this administration have brought the world to the brink of nuclear disasters in the Ukraine as well as in the Middle East. But to pin a hope on any of these two parties, I think, would ignore a long record of consensus about Israel and its interests within the ruling elite of the United States.
Amen. Let's turn to the 7 countries you alluded to. Both of them on the borders of Israel are proving more than capable of fighting back. Even the destroyed Gaza Strip is still fighting back, still taking its toll of the invasion forces. But the Lebanese resistance would appear not to have been cowed in any way by the killing of their leader, Hassan Nasrallah. The skill of the Lebanese resistance and the toll that it's taking on the Israeli invaders is really quite spectacular when you think about it. Is that going to cause any second thoughts in Tel Aviv, do you think?
I think it all depends on the Americans. And the Americans have basically unconditionally supported all aggression and genocide by Israel. But what you're saying is true. The resilience and the courage of the resistance against Israel is a story that's going to be told for many generations. We're talking about stories like the Viet Cong, and it's all because there's a quest of justice that cannot be smashed by military force. Israel at a crisis today. I mean, just last week, new recording of a cabinet meeting with Golda Meir was released in the Israeli press. In it, she says, whenever Arabs are no more afraid of us, we are finished. Well, I wish I can tell Golda Meir now that you are finished because Arabs are not afraid of you. I mean, look what happened in Gaza with all the genocide. They are not surrendering. And there is no way that the people of Lebanon are going to surrender or the resistance is going to surrender. I mean, we now are discovering that Hezbollah is bigger than a movement that is all controlled by Hassan Nasrallah or by Iran or anything like that. It's a mass movement. It is by people who are rooted in the land of Lebanon. And they are fighting for their liberation and for their dignity, the way they have been fighting Israeli occupation since the 1980s. And George, our story with Israel preceded the creation of Hamas, preceded the creation of Hezbollah, preceded the creation of the PLO. Arabs have been intimidated and brutalized by the state of Israel before even the state was established in 1948. Since the 1930s, Zionist gangs in Palestine resorted to the most dastardly acts of terrorism against the native. They realized that they will not submit, so we will use massive force. But this is the dilemma of the Zionist entity, which is no matter how much force they use, they have been using force for over a century. And the native population is not cowering in. They are not submitting to the wishes of the occupiers. And they will continue to fight, and eventually they'll be victorious. I mean, it is not poetry, it's what's happening in the ground. Despite all these attacks on Lebanon, in Beirut and the suburbs and South Lebanon, they are destroying villages wholesale. Look what they have done in Gaza. And yet, the people are still fighting, and they will continue to fight. And this is why the Zionist project is doomed. It cannot continue. And the only thing that's keeping it alive today is the United States and its coterie of subservient allies in NATO Europe.
Well, I suppose the obvious question is why? Why is the United States and its vassals in Europe, why are we reinforcing failure? Why are we doubling down on something that is destroying the soft power of our countries, making people hate us all over the world, as well as drastically reducing our chances of entry into heaven if and when the judgment day comes? Why, Professor? Why?
Well, I mean, there's no question there are many reasons for that. I mean, there are historical reasons having to do with the Holocaust and the feeling that the American establishment did nothing. Actually, FDR did not allow more than 3,000 refugees in 1943 to come into the United States while they were calling for unlimited immigration to Palestine. I mean, they wanted the Jews to go over there, but not into their own land in Europe. And as you know, most of the Zionist champions, including Lord Balfour, were unabashed anti-Semites. So in the United States, there has been the feeling during the Cold War that Israel can do the dirty work of the United States, and it has done so. I mean, if you think of every civil war in the Middle East in my lifetime, Israel was doing the dirty work with the United States or on the part of the United States. I mean, the civil war in Sudan, the Sahara conflict, the civil war in Lebanon, the events of September 1970 in Jordan, Oman rebellion in 1970s, all these events, and of course in northern Iraq with the Kurds. Israel has been involved in all that. But what America is realizing now is that the argument that we need to give them all these unlimited supply of weapons and all these tens of billions of dollars in order that we don't have to go over there and deploy troops is not working anymore, right? I mean, Israel has proven in this conflict against two non-armies, namely Hamas and Hezbollah, they cannot defend themselves by themselves. I mean, Israel today requires the assistance, the military assistance directly of the United States, of Germany, of France, of Britain, and of a coterie of Arab countries because it can't stand on its feet. I mean, if you leave Israel to the natives, I think they can give it a good beating, as they are doing right now.
Now, of course, the world waits for an Israeli attack on Iran, which may turn out, well, it may not happen, it may turn out to be purely performative, or it may turn out to be the beginning of an all-out war, which may very well quickly involve the superpowers and could develop into a nuclear exchange. What's your view on what is going to happen next between Israel and Iran?
I think with Biden in the White House, anything could happen. That man could easily drag the world into a nuclear holocaust without being aware what's happening around him or where he is. I mean, I agree with you about the association of old age with senility. That is absolutely ageist and should not be acceptable in the debate. But in the case of Biden, he's shown himself to be mentally incapacitated and incapable of leading the nation or even the world. So I think in the case of Iran, in the last missile attack on Israel by Iran, and they were very precise and they were penetrated the air defenses of Israel, for which taxpayer in America spent so much money, they intimidated Israel and they showed Israel they can hit them anywhere they want. But notice the moral inequivalency between the Arabs, the Iranians, and Israel on the other hand. Notice that the Arab side, I know in the case of Lebanon, the resistance, in the case of Iran, they are not attacking civilians. Israel is a state that specializes as a matter of policy to terrorize the population by deliberately targeting civilians. They have done so in South Lebanon. They have done so in Beirut, in the suburbs. Imagine, this is a state that is willing to flatten 6 residential buildings in order to kill one man. I know of no country in the world that has these standards of lack of ethics, of criminality on a global scale like the state of Israel. And it can only get away with this impunity by virtue of strong American support, unconditional American support.
The United Nations is showing all the signs of the earlier League of Nations, isn't it? Being completely ignored when it makes decisions, or in the case of the ICJ, incapable of responding to judicial decisions of its own court, being insulted, and its officials being routinely murdered and threatened with murder by a state which came into being as a result of a United Nations resolution. What does the UN do about this usurping power that sits in its ranks?
Absolutely nothing, dear Comrade George. I mean, the United Nations, all international organizations, ICJ, ICC, these are all tools used by the United States. I mean, we're talking about the ICC, where they admitted that they were intimidated directly and threatened by the state of Israel. When the ICC wanted to investigate the scale of civilian slaughter by US bombs in Afghanistan, they were threatened by the United States and they were going to arrest them. There is no international law, there's no international legality. And for that, I say, people of the developing countries, they may be better served if they go about their freedom and their struggle with the understanding that the United Nations has absolutely no role. It can only be used when the United States permits it to be used, and only for its own purposes, when they release Security Council resolution that is in the service of Israel. But if it's not to the liking of Israel, they are totally ignored. It's like in 2003, the George Bush administration justified the invasion of Iraq by saying there were United Nations resolutions unimplemented in the case of Iraq, so we want to go there and invade and implement them. But how many resolutions are there between the Security Council and the General Assembly about Israel that are supposedly to discipline Israel, to punish Israel, and they are left unimplemented because the United States won't allow it? We don't live under the lure of justice on a global scale.
Lastly, Prof, I'm going to Kazan in a day or so for the BRICS summit. There will be a lot of Arab leaders there. Some of them are, it would appear, still afraid of Israel. What should I say to them?
I mean, it depends which Arab state we're talking about. I mean, if you're talking about UAE and Saudi Arabia, these are some of the most dictatorial, despotic regimes of the region and of the world, indeed, and yet they are very close allies of Israel. Those people do not speak for the aspiration of the Arab people at all. And during this war, George, I tell you that their media are being used to service the Israeli war effort. They are totally in contradiction with the aspiration and the sentiments of the Arab people, which are totally opposed to the state of Israel. And even public opinion surveys conducted in those countries by Pew, among others, show overwhelming opposition and rejection of the state of Israel by Arab population. 95% of people in Saudi Arabia are opposed to any relations with Israel. Yet, the despotic ruler over there has been negotiating, continues to negotiate, amid all this carnage and genocide with Israel in order to achieve a price, to extract a price from the United States in order to sign a peace treaty with Israel. So basically, personally, I have nothing to say to these people except to abdicate and let the people rule themselves.
Professor, you're a star man. Thanks very much indeed for a dazzling performance.
Thank you very much.
As usual. Professor Asad Abu Khalil, professor at California State University.